Hello everyone, my name is Dexter Burns and my presentation is on genocide particularly in the Western Hemisphere. When most people think of acts of genocide, they immediately think of events in Europe, Asia, and Africa. However, since its discovery by Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch explorers, the Western Hemisphere has been engulfed in acts of genocide with the massacring of millions of indigenous peoples, African slaves, and later on political prisoners, which was very common, especially during the military dictatorships of Latin America, which we will discuss later. There are many reasons why the slaughter of human beings was used throughout the history of the world. The Nazis used genocide to exterminate the Jews of Europe. The Rwandan genocide was an ethnic cleansing of Tutsi civilians. The list goes on and on throughout the history of the world. After extensive research on this topic, I've narrowed and compiled 7 basic reasons why acts of genocide was committed in the Western Hemisphere. In this presentation, I will explain how and why these things occurred, and we will also look at some examples here and there to provide a better understanding of the tragic events that took place on our side of the world. The reasons genocide was used in the Americas include the following: total conquest, subjugation of indigenous peoples and African slaves, eliminating Native American populations from coveted territories, instilling fear into populations in order to coerce them into performing forced labor, slave rebellions, eliminating political opposition, and ethnic cleansings. The first one we'll discuss is total conquest. Once the Europeans arrived, they began their agendas of total conquest. For many settlers, total conquest meant defeating the indigenous populations and conquering the territory for their own nations. For others, religious conversion and the potential for becoming wealthy were added to the other two. Whatever the motive, the Native Americans were seen as obstacles who had to be either relocated or completely destroyed. Many indigenous groups such as the Mayans or Aztecs of lower North America and Central America were skilled warriors who were able to halt Spanish conquest for decades. Others, such as the indigenous people of Hispaniola and the surrounding Caribbean islands, were slaughtered more easily. These tragic events became heightened throughout the centuries with the establishment of the Atlantic slave trade and the disenfranchisement of African and indigenous peoples, which we will talk about next. The next reason for genocide was the subjugation of indigenous peoples and African slaves. The enslavement of both indigenous and African peoples in the New World created various societies in which the deaths and murders of millions became conventional phenomena. Mass killings were used in the Americas by Europeans to subjugate Native Americans and African slaves. These methods proved efficient in decreasing the indigenous populations throughout North and South America. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Native Americans were often victims of organized genocidal massacres. These were intentional campaigns used to slaughter as many of them as possible. Next was the elimination of Native American populations from coveted territories. This actually ties in with the first point I made of total conquest. As I said before, European settlers sought to seize territories for themselves and their kingdoms. Therefore, Native Americans that occupied these territories had to be eliminated. In reality, every nation on this side of the world was acquired by Europeans who slaughtered indigenous populations in order to claim territories. However, for the sake of time, we will only look at a few notable incidents. The Indian Removal Act, also known as the Trail of Tears, was sanctioned by President Andrew Jackson in 1830. This referendum required the forced relocation of thousands of Native American Indians from their homelands. Over 17,000 Native Americans, mostly Cherokee and Chickasaw communities, were rounded up by the American Army and forced into unsanitary holding facilities as they awaited forced exile. As was the American common practice during forced relocations, the Indians were marched through areas where it was known that cholera and other diseases were epidemic. Many days were cold and rainy. The people were often severely underfed, and the few rations they did receive were either spoiled or rotten. By the time the Indians arrived in Indian Territory, under half of the drove survived the trip. Many more died upon arrival of lingering illnesses and starvation. The Las Pampas massacre in Argentina, led by General Julio Argentina Roca, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Indians from the plains of Las Pampas, can best be summarized by a statement made by General Roca in which he said, quote, "Our self-respect as a virile people obliges us to put down as soon as possible, by reason or by force, this handful of savages who destroy our wealth and prevent us from definitely occupying, in the name of law, the richest and most fertile lands of the Republic." The Wounded Knee Massacre involved the annihilation of an entire Lakota Indian tribe in the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota by American troops. The troops first used cannon fire to kill the men of the tribe, and later stormed tents and shelters and shot the hundreds of remaining women and children. The next reason genocide was used in the Americas was to instill fear into the people in order to coerce them into performing forced labor. Again, these actions were taken throughout the Americas, but one of the most prominent examples could include the organized slaughter of thousands during the South American rubber boom. Thousands of Amazonian Indians were forced to carve rubber from trees. Those tribal communities that refused were either tortured or completely massacred. The overseers spared no one. Entire communities of indigenous men, women, and children were wiped out. These actions were taken in rubber fields throughout Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. The sadistic practices of the South American rubber boom would eventually spread across the Atlantic into the African Congo, where thousands more would be slaughtered in rubber fields under the rule of Leopold II of Belgium. Slave rebellions. The killing of thousands of African slaves also proved powerful in securing racial domination over blacks in the Caribbean and Brazil. Whenever blacks rebelled against their white oppressors, usually by trying to run away or even fighting back, slave owners sought to deter other slaves from following their lead. This was usually done by public whipping the individuals in front of the other slaves, or even by public execution. Nonetheless, slave communities throughout the Americas still chose to rebel against their masters, sometimes by meticulously organized slave revolts. However, most slave rebellions were unsuccessful. Usually after a slave revolt was crushed, the remaining slave community would be slaughtered and replaced. Historically, slave rebellions throughout the Americas usually ended in genocidal massacres. This was the case in the 1816 Barbadian slave uprising dubbed General Busa's War by Barbadian black patronists. Busa was an African-born slave who worked on a sugar plantation in St. Philip on the British Isle of Barbados. You can see the map below. Barbados is enclosed in a light blue box. On Easter Sunday, Busa organized around 400 of his fellow laborers in an attempt to seize the plantation for themselves. They hoped their rebellion would set off a chain reaction on other plantations and eventually force white people from the island altogether. British troops stationed on the island, immediately opened fire on the slaves. The soldiers, better armed and trained, quickly crushed the rebellion, killing hundreds of blacks all over the island. The government of Barbados then executed hundreds more suspected of conspiracy. The mass slaughters of human beings were also committed by oppressed people against their oppressors. Notably, during the 1780 native Bolivian uprising led by Indian chief Tupac Takari, in which thousands of Spanish colonists were killed. Perhaps the most famous example occurred during the Haitian Revolution of 1804. You can see again the map below. Haiti is pointed to by the red arrow. You can identify Haiti by the red arrow. Haitian slaves freed themselves and declared war against their white oppressors, killing every non-black person in sight. By the time the French left Hispaniola for good, the white population in Haiti was non-existent, and Haiti had been declared the first black republic of the New World. The next reason genocide was used in the Americas was eliminating political opposition. Genocide was also used much later in the Western Hemisphere during the military dictatorships that plagued Latin America throughout the 20th century. If you take a look at the map here, every country highlighted in green experienced a period of military dictatorship, which is virtually all of Latin America. Acts of genocide on a large scale were committed by dictators, mostly in South America. The two most notable bloody dictatorships were that of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet and Paraguayan dictator Alfredo Stroessner. Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet was notorious for his top-secret death squads known as the Caravan of Death. The purpose of each squad was to eliminate political opposition leaders, their families, and supportive communities. Many people were killed by this militia group, and many more unconfirmed victims are suspected to have been murdered by Pinochet's Caravan of Death. In this case, genocide was used to eliminate political opposition and inflict fear into the hearts of millions of Chileans. Paraguayan dictator Alfredo Stroessner is remembered by thousands in his country and throughout Latin America for his implementation of Operation Condor. The official goal of Operation Condor was to eliminate and prevent Marxist and terrorist threats to the government of Paraguay. However, in practice, it was an internal campaign by Stroessner's personal police force to go after anyone whom Stroessner did not like. Operation Condor was used to justify the actions of police personnel, which included illegal arrest and detention, torture, and extrajudicial killings. Just like Augusto Pinochet's Caravan of Death, the majority of Stroessner's police force victims were political opposition leaders and their families. The victims were usually ordinary Paraguayan men and women from a variety of different backgrounds and professions. Sometimes genocide can be used to exterminate members of a population. This practice is known as ethnic cleansing. Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo is most infamously known for his ordering of the Parsley Massacre. The Parsley Massacre was an attempt to completely rid the Dominican Republic of its Haitian minority. Historically, Haiti and the Dominican Republic have been engaged in many wars and political cultural conflicts. The two countries occupy the same Caribbean island of Hispaniola, which has placed them at even worse odds. In 1937, Trujillo decided once and for all to exterminate all Haitians living in his country. Trujillo ordered his troops to kill anyone who couldn't pronounce perejil, the Spanish word for parsley, hence Parsley Massacre, Because of the French, they typically have a hard time pronouncing the R, it was easier to distinguish between the two ethnicities. In just under a week's time, Dominican soldiers and civilians armed with rifles and machetes slaughtered over 15,000 Haitian citizens and descendants. In recent years, the international community has sought to prevent genocide in the future and prosecute it when it does happen. The establishment of the International Criminal Court on July 1st, 2002 was one of the first efforts used in the war against genocide. There was also a new position created by the United Nations uh, called the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. And on July 17, 2012, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed Adama Dejing of Senegal. This is the end of my presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.